Hello, sophomores. If you notice, we've progressed from the center of the empire towards the outside in our last couple of videos. We talked about the structure of the Roman government and its administration. Really wasn't all that big. We talked about the provinces, which had Roman governors over them, but in many ways were fairly autonomous and self-governing at the local level. Then we talked about the Roman army and the frontiers, and we talked about client kingdoms, which were sort of inside the Roman sphere or inside their orbit of influence, but that were not really ruled directly by Rome. So what happens if we go one step further? So let's talk about some of the non-Roman players here in the early Roman Empire. So talk about beyond Rome for a second. Well, I suppose in sequence this is still under the Principate and the Principate government, but I'm recording this on a new day, so it feels like a new lecture. So basically, I want to take you on a quick tour around the outskirts of the empire and some of the peoples the Romans interacted with. So to begin with, I'll talk about the east, where Rome has expanded to conquer Asia Minor, Syria, Palestine, and now Egypt. At the limits of the Roman Empire, to the south, into the east, in many cases, you have deserts. The Sahara Desert, with Bedouin tribesmen in the south, go through Egypt to the limits of the Nile River, and you get something similar, and rocks make the Nile River non-navigable. To the east, you get Arabia with the Arabian Peninsula. Again, not very much going on there. Trade caravans going towards Persia and India, but that's about it. If you go to Mesopotamia, though, and then towards Persia, you will meet the Parthian Empire, which is worth mentioning. Parthia is really the only really major state that's a large kingdom or an empire that could be any sort of peer competitor to the Roman Empire during this period. You may recall last year, this was the area ruled by the old Persian Empire. Alexander the Great conquered it. It was ruled by Greek kings for 300 years. But then they collapsed near the end of this period, and a new Persian dynasty called the Parthian Empire took its place. The Parthians were steppe nomads who'd come down from the north. They conquered Persia. And they revived some aspects of Persian culture, but also they kept a lot of continuity with some of the old Greek rulership, along with their own steppe nomad traditions. So basically, this is Persia, okay? What had been Persia. They're steppe nomads. They specialized in light cavalry. They fought Rome a fair amount. Through a lot of this period, Rome and Parthia go back and forth. There's never any really huge decisive wars. Basically, each empire is too far away from one another to really threaten the other. Crassus had attempted to invade them, you may recall last year, and he and his army was destroyed at the Battle of Carrhae, and they lost the legionary standards. Augustus actually sent an army to sort of cow and temporarily defeat some of the Parthians in Mesopotamia. But then he struck a peace deal with the Parthians and he regained the lost standards. And that was a big propaganda for victory for Augustus. We brought home the golden eagle standards that Crassus had lost. Rome's honor has been restored. So Parthia is a rival to Rome. Throughout much of this period, Rome and Parthia go back and forth. To be honest, at the end of the day, Rome is stronger. And Rome will ultimately win more than it loses against Parthia. And we'll see that from time to time. So just know that, Parthia is Rome's one big rival to the east. But that's it. Rome really doesn't have any other rivals or competitors who could really give it a run for its money or even do a whole lot to seriously threaten them. Let's switch gears and talk a little bit about Germania. Germania, right? If you go up along the Rhine River, to some extent along the Danube as well, you have various Germanic barbarians. We met people like this when they invaded parts of the Roman Republic. Is when Marius beat them, the Cimbri and the Teutons. Julius Caesar fought some of the Germanic tribes, and he built a bridge going across the Rhine River, and cowed the Germans and made them, go back and hide in the forests. And then they defeated the Romans at the Teutoburg, right? Teutoburg Forest. When Arminius, this German chieftain, betrayed the Romans, led them into an ambush, and the Germans ambushed them. Famous Roman defeat. And when the Romans came through years later to find what had happened to their men, what happened to our whole army, they found the bleached bones and skeletons of Romans killed en masse. Some of the skeletons had even been nailed to an oak tree, like when they were still living, run them with spears and leave them hanging there. Or after dead, decapitated and their skulls are nailed to a tree. It's all very scary stuff. And it sort of gives this, oh my gosh, the Germans, this intimidating Germanic tribes, these intimidating Germanic tribes that are a real foe to the Romans. And there's certainly this idea, I think, a little bit of this notion of, yes, the strong Germanic tribes, and they'll play an important role. We know one day they will destroy Rome, right? When the Romans become weak and soft and decadent, and then the big, strong Germans will come down. We have our image, this image in our head of Germans being big, strong, kind of like Vikings. They're kind of a cousin people to the Vikings. So we have this sort of notion of the Germans as strong, maybe primitive, but also brave, noble, pure, right? Contrasting with the decadence of the Romans. Much of this comes from an account by Tacitus. In fact, it's a really famous reading by Tacitus, the Roman historian, where he talks about the Germanic peoples. Tacitus wrote a lot about some of the Roman commanders and then later emperors and generals who fought along the Rhine in the German area. So he learned a lot about the Germanic peoples, and so he talks about them. And Tacitus's account is actually very positive. You almost get the sense that he likes the Germans. They have, kind of a more primitive, simple lifestyle, but they're not prone to the soft luxuries that weaken the Romans. They're more democratic. Each man who runs a house gets a vote in the tribe. German women are much more outspoken, and they throw their weight around, says Tacitus. And that's not something the Romans would necessarily like, but they're certainly strong and they've got spirit. Tacitus says that when German tribes go and fight each other, the women from the households will go and stand sort of behind the battle a ways away and yell to their men, sort of encouraging them to do battle, but also to sort of threaten their own men, like, listen, don't lose, because if you lose, then those other guys, they're going to come and take us and carry us off into captivity. So it's like shaming the men to keep fighting. He praises them for their honesty, their virtue, their charity and openness towards strangers, and these other things. And he's really kind of saying, these Germans are almost better than us. This is actually weirdly enough, this is a trope. You see this actually happen a lot in settled, civilized communities and nations, where sometimes we like to paint a picture of decadence, right? Civilization, wealth, big cities, art. That can create decadence and corruption, loose living, softness, right? Contrast that with, people who are almost like our ancestors. They are pure and primitive like we were once. We should try to go back to their early primitive living sort of thing. And it's funny, you see this pop up actually a lot in the ancient world, and then even in the modern world. So Tacitus, I think clearly when he's talking about the great virtues of the Germans, he's also critiquing the Romans of his own day. The poet Ovid says something similar about them. And then many writers throughout history have done this sort of thing. I mean, one of the most famous versions is Rousseau, a French writer during the French Enlightenment, who talks about how civilization corrupts people. And he says, man in his natural state, right? This is where the noble savage myth comes from. The noble savage idea is better, more primitive and nicer. Various American writers have done this, and thinkers have done this occasionally with, settled European Americans and then Native Americans. The Disney movie Pocahontas is actually kind of like this a little bit, if you think about it. And I'm not actually having you read Tacitus on the Germans. It's useful, I think, to understand how the Romans thought about the Germans. So this is kind of how Tacitus and the Romans thought. The bigger reason I'm not having us read Tacitus is just we don't have time. We've got to move faster. But I think there's actually... I take Tacitus' account of the Germans and this whole notion of your noble savage as a virtuous thing. I'm a little unsure of this. I think you have to be really careful. I think there are some problems with this. And so let me say some other things about them. And I don't mean to, I'm not going to be bashing the Germans or denigrating them. Let me just point out some things that I think are often missed. And let me start with a simple thing that's kind of missed, a throwaway point I made. I said, when the Romans came through, years after the Battle of the Teutoburg, they found these, skeletons, nailed to trees or whatnot. And you go, wait a minute, the Romans came back? The Romans were back in Germania? I thought the Romans were defeated, and the Romans stopped conquering the place, right? This is how it's often mentioned in books. Like, the Romans were continuing their invasions. It's kind of like Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, and so then under Augustus, they thought, well, now we're going to go and conquer Germany. But then they didn't. They were defeated at the Teutoburg, and so the Romans stopped, right? There's this notion that, the Romans couldn't conquer the Germans. Well, if that's true and the Romans couldn't conquer the Germans, what are Roman troops doing scouting the Teutoburg battle site years later? Because this misses something. In reality, you see the Romans came back and found the Teutoburg battle site to bury their men, recover whatever honor they could, and then also the Romans ripped up the valley and found every Germanic tribe they could and punished them really badly. Because Romans and Germans actually fought a lot. It wasn't like one battle of the Teutoburg and then that was it. In reality, Rome and the various Germanic tribes fought, and generally, Rome won. All the time. If you read between the lines in some of the accounts of the Teutoburg Forest, you realize that the Germans had hardly any armor or proper weapons. If they did, it was usually stuff they'd gotten from the Romans. Many German warriors were attacking the Romans with spears which didn't even have metal points. Literally just long sticks that they had, hewn a point on, with their knife, if they had one, and then hardened the spear point of your stick in a fire. So you're literally talking about guys, with sticks attacking Roman troops. This is a little bit like, Ewoks versus Stormtroopers in The Return of the Jedi. Only the Stormtroopers usually winning. Because that's what usually happens. The Germans had a pretty simple, I'm going to say this nicely, they had a simple material culture. Which is a nice way of saying they were poor and didn't have much technology. They also lived in small societies. So they didn't have a lot of large organization. It took a lot to get German tribes to unite to do anything big. Most of the time they fought each other. Now, I'm not really knocking them. It's not really their fault. We must begin with, as we so usually should do when you're beginning to talk about any people, you need to talk about their geography. The geography of Germany is covered in mountains, or it's mountainous, and forests. Then Germany is also divided by rivers. But the big thing to know here is that this part of Germany we're talking about is mountains and forests. Now, Eastern Germany, like modern Prussia, that has plains and farmland, but that's 500 miles away. If Germany's that big, maybe not. But yeah, this is about right. We're talking mountains and forests. There's not much cleared land for agriculture. And so when you look at what the Germans were doing, even the ones Tacitus is talking about, they practiced slash and burn agriculture. Burn down some trees, plant as simple a plot as you could, and then after a few years when you depleted the soil, your whole village moved on. So like almost semi-nomad. So you have very few towns and cities. No large settlements you could use to start a manufacturing base or a political base or a military base that you could use to fight the Romans on their own terms. And so what would happen is when the Romans would go through Germany, because it's covered in mountains and forests, it's very hard to move troops around. The locals can just go and hide in the forests and in the mountains. So you come through, find whatever settlements and huts the Germans have, burn them to send a message. That's right, you Germans, don't mess with us. And then you leave. There's nothing else you can do. They don't have capital cities that you can garrison in and say, right, you Germans, we've conquered the territory. Put simply, Germany was too primitive to conquer. I mean, you could flood Germany with 500,000 troops, but what's the point? You don't get anything out of it. So Rome didn't fail to conquer Germany because of some wonderful, heroic military virtue of the Germans. It's because Germany was too poor, and it wasn't really worth it, basically. So instead, what you see happen over a long period of time, is that the Romans work to manage the various barbarians with diplomacy, trade, some careful alliances, spy work, espionage, stirring up wars in the Germans. Basically, if one Germanic tribe is getting too powerful and they're starting to raid into Roman territory, because that's a big thing you're worried about, raiding into Roman territory and burning Roman settlements. You launch punitive raids to burn their huts, teach them a lesson, but then maybe you bribe other tribes to attack that German tribe. Or you try to cultivate friendly relations with some German tribes. Hey, instead of coming and burning our settlements, when we're not here with troops to defend it, why don't you stop doing that and we'll cut you in on trade deals and you can get first access to fine Roman manufactured goods, because the Roman material culture is much higher and better than the Germans, and they have stuff the Germans want, like metal, textiles, and wine. That's a big one too. So using these things, diplomacy, trade, picking and choosing winners and losers in German society, and those sorts of things. So the Germans have things to trade too: slaves, amber, furs, lumber, these sorts of things. There's things the Romans want too. So there's actually a lot of trade that goes on between the barbarian world and the Roman world. Over time, the various barbarians north of the empire will slowly grow in numbers, wealth, mostly due to contact with Rome. But that's a several hundred-year process. And just gonna leave that one there. This is a little we're gonna check in on this point a couple weeks from now. We're just gonna set this process on slow cooking. We're gonna put it on the back burner, and we're just gonna give this one about 300 years to develop, and we'll see what happens. But that's all at a much later date. So long for now.